He's a relic of a past that's already dead. He can't hold on to his power, let alone a young wife. You have no idea what monsters I keep on a leash. Zuri didn't scream when she saw the dark ink coiling up his neck in the hallway. She screamed when she was hidden in the shadows of his wedding suite and heard the one sentence that shattered her perception of the frail old man. She knew something was wrong the moment the city's most dangerous men bowed to that 70-year-old man as if he were a god of war. But it wasn't until the wedding night, trapped in the silence of his soul estate, that the truth cracked open. He wasn't failing. He wasn't harmless. And when he caught her eye in the mirror, not with the gaze of an old man but a predator, she finally understood she hadn't just overheard a secret. She had been claimed by a truth far more terrifying than any debt. Welcome back to the Afrokoreanstoryspace, besties. Today's story is a special request for Zuri. I've used your name just like you asked, so make sure you say hi in the comments if you're watching. To my returning besties, if you stop in the middle of this story, you will have dreams wondering how it ended. Drop a comment right now if you are already excited about the suspense this story is about to give you. The soul winter bit through the thin fabric of Zuri's uniform as she scrubbed the marble floors of the Kong estate. Every repetitive motion of her brush was a reminder of the weight she carried across an ocean. Back in Kampala, her sisters were sleeping in a house that stayed standing only because Zuri had agreed to vanish into the shadows of South Korea. Her father, a man who had always chased fortunes that didn't belong to him, had finally gambled with something he couldn't lose: his family's lives. He had stood trembling in a dark soul alley 3 months ago, bowing to men with cold eyes and sharper knives, until Kong Dae-sung had intervened like a silent storm. Zuri didn't just work for the old boss. She was a living payment for a debt of $300,000. Money her father had lost in an illegal trading scheme that had gone up in flames. Her passport sat locked in a safe behind Dae-sung's heavy mahogany desk, making the sprawling estate feel less like a workplace and more like a gilded cage. Every time she caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw a stranger. Her dark skin stood out against the sterile white silk luxury of the mansion, a constant reminder that she was a prized acquisition in a world that didn't speak her language. She had been promised that if she served for 1 year, the men who threatened to burn her family's home in Uganda would stay away. So she kept her head down. She learned to polish the silver until it mirrored the fear in her brown eyes, and to move as silently as the ghosts of Dae-sung's past. She heard the whispers from the other staff, the mockery of the old boss who was supposedly losing his grip, a man they called a failing relic behind closed doors. They thought he was weak, a 70-year-old man who was more shadow than substance. But Zuri felt the predatory grace whenever he walked into a room, a cold energy that made the air turn brittle. As she reached the double doors of the master wedding suite, her heart hammered against her ribs. Tonight was his wedding night, and the air in the mansion felt thick with a secret that was about to crack open. The golden handles of the wedding suite felt cold against Zuri's palm, a stark contrast to the sweat gathering at her hairline. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of excessive luxury, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint metallic scent of winter air. Her task was simple: ensure the suite was flawless before the old boss returned with his new bride. Zuri moved through the room like a ghost, her dark fingers trembling as she smoothed the silk sheets, material that felt more like chains than comfort. As she reached for a stray glass near the window, the heavy mahogany door clicked shut. Zuri froze. Kong Dae-sung stood by the entrance, but he wasn't the man she had seen earlier. Gone was the slight slouch and the careful, labored gait of a 70-year-old. He moved with the sudden lethal grace of a predator, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored black suit perfectly. The mask of the failing relic had slipped, revealing a face that showed strength rather than age. He didn't see her at first, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He reached up, loosening his silk tie with a hand that was steady and powerful, his muscular frame speaking of a discipline that defied the rumors of his weakness. Zuri's breath caught in her throat, a flutter of uncomfortable realization stirring in her stomach. This was the man her father had bowed to, not a frail elder, but a man who controlled outcomes with cold, calculated precision. He turned slightly, the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck coiling toward his sharp jaw as he leaned over a small console. His voice, when he finally spoke into a hidden phone, was deep and carrying a slight Korean accent, far too resonant for the man the world mocked. "The trap is set," he whispered, his eyes locking onto the glittering Seoul skyline behind the glass. "Let them believe I am an old man with one foot in the grave. By dawn, their empires will belong to me." Zuri backed into the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had heard the one sentence that shattered the world she thought she knew. He wasn't weak. He wasn't harmless. And as his piercing eyes suddenly shifted, cutting through the dim light to the exact corner where she stood, she realized she was no longer just a maid. She was a witness to a monster who had finally dropped his disguise. The silence in the suite was so thick it felt like it could shatter. Zuri pressed her back against the velvet curtains, her dark skin blending into the shadows, but her wide eyes remained fixed on Kang Dae-sung. He didn't move toward her yet. Instead, he stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the glittering Seoul skyline. The man who had moved with a labored gait in public now stood with a muscular frame that radiated a terrifying, cold, calculated energy. He was still holding the phone, his thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw where the silver stubble caught the light. Zuri held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she feared he could hear it. Then he spoke again, not to the person on the line, but as if acknowledging the truth for the first time in the open air. "The girl thinks she is a payment for a debt," he murmured, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that carried a slight Korean accent. "But she is the only soul in this city who hasn't tried to kill me yet." He turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes slicing through the darkness to find her exact position. Zuri's knees nearly buckled. The secret wasn't just about his strength or his hidden power. It was the realization that the entire marriage, the debt, and her presence in this room were parts of a much larger, more violent game. "I didn't buy you to save your father, Zuri," he said, stepping into the light. He moved with the grace of a predator, closing the distance between them in 3 effortless strides. "I claimed you because you are the only one they cannot use against me." The truth cracked open. He hadn't been too old or weak, as the rivals mocked. He was a man who had staged his own decline to flush out his enemies, and she was the prized acquisition meant to serve as his final shield. As he stopped inches from her, she could smell his expensive cologne, and feel the heat radiating from a body that was far from failing. Her terror remained, but it was now laced with a flutter in her stomach she couldn't explain. She finally understood. She hadn't been hired to clean his home. She had been claimed for something far more terrifying than service or marriage. Zuri's lungs seized as she tried to merge with the heavy fabric of the curtains, but there was no longer any hiding. Kang Dae-sung stepped toward her, his movements fluid and calculated, stripping away every lie the world believed about his aging body. The man who had entered the room was gone. In his place was a predator who moved like a man half his age, his broad shoulders casting a long, intimidating shadow across the silk-covered floor. Each of his strides was silent, heavy with the strength rather than age she had previously been too blind to see. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, and saw the silver stubble on a jaw that was set with lethal intent. Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up, her terror living in her brown eyes, and found herself pinned by piercing eyes that locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. She was a witness to his strength, a stranger who had seen behind the mask of the failing relic, and the air between them turned brittle with the weight of that knowledge. "You weren't supposed to be here, Zuri," he said, his deep voice vibrating through the small space between them. It wasn't the voice of a man nearing his end. It was the voice of a man who ran an empire that spans 3 countries, a voice that made men fear his name. His hand moved and Zuri flinched, but he didn't strike. Instead, his finger traced her jaw, the touch surprisingly gentle, yet feeling like a brand of absolute possession. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, just as they had been to his brides in the chapel, and Zuri felt a flutter in her stomach that made her despise her own body's betrayal. "Now you know," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "You've seen what they are not allowed to see." Zuri lifted her chin, her fingers trembling against her uniform, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She realized then that her passport was in his possession, and her family's safety depended entirely on how she handled the next few seconds. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She had been claimed for something far more terrifying than service. She was now a secret keeper for a man who wasn't harmless and wasn't weak, and the realization shattered her world more than the debt ever could. Dae-sung did not pull away. Instead, he loomed over her, his presence stripping the air from the room until Zuri felt she was breathing in his very scent, expensive cologne and something sharp like ozone before a storm. He stepped closer, backing her against the cold glass of the window where Seoul's glittering skyline spread out behind her like a sea of diamonds. Zuri's dark fingers were white-knuckled as they gripped the velvet curtains, her breath hitching in her chest. "You look at me and see an old man," he murmured, his deep voice carrying that rhythmic, slight Korean accent that seemed to vibrate against her very skin. "You hear the whispers of the street and think the lion has lost his teeth." He reached up, unbuttoning the cuffs of his black suit jacket with a discipline and power that made her heart hammer. As he shed the heavy fabric, the muscular frame beneath his dress shirt was revealed, shoulders that were broad and unyielding, a face that showed strength rather than age. He was handsome in a way that made her uncomfortable, a predator disguised in the trappings of a gentleman. Zuri's mind screamed at her to run, yet she was mentally trapped, her body frozen by the sheer intensity of his gaze. He took her hand, placing her small, trembling palm against his chest. Beneath the fine silk, she felt the steady, powerful thrum of a heart that beat with the grace of a predator. There was no frailty here, only strength and a cold, calculated resolve. "Age has taken nothing from me that matters, Zuri," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with an amusement perhaps or approval that sent ice through her veins. He leaned down, his sharp jaw inches from her face, making her realize that the man the world mocked was a ghost, and the man standing before her was a king who had claimed her as his witness. She had no idea what he was capable of, but as his muscular frame crowded her into the glass, she understood that her survival now depended on the mercy of a man who had forgotten the meaning of the word. Dae-sung released her hand, but he didn't retreat. He turned back toward the skyline, the lights of Seoul reflecting in his steady gaze. "The woman the world saw me marry today is a ghost," he said, his voice dropping into that cold, calculated tone that made the hair on Zuri's neck stand up. "A political arrangement designed to satisfy my board of directors and pacify the vultures waiting for me to die. She has her role and she has her price. But she is part of the lie." He turned his head slightly, his piercing eyes tracking Zuri's every move in the mirror's reflection. "You, however, were an accident. A maid who stayed too long in the shadows and saw the truth I've spent a decade hiding. In my world, Zuri, a witness, is usually a liability to be removed." Zuri flinched, her dark fingers knotting together, but Dae-sung's expression remained calm but predatory. "But I find myself in need of something rarer than loyalty," he continued, stepping closer until his muscular frame once again dominated her field of vision. "I need a mirror. Someone who knows exactly what I am capable of so that I don't have to pretend when the doors are locked. My little bride is a shield for the public, but you are the only one who knows the lion still has his teeth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Zuri's breath hitched. It was her passport. He didn't hand it to her. He merely let her see it, a reminder of the gilded cage she was trapped in. "Your father's debt is $300,000, a pittance for the secret you now hold. I could have you silenced, or I could make you the most prized acquisition in this house." He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, as a shiver of terror and disbelief raced down her spine. "You will continue your duties. You will be my eyes where I cannot see, and my witness when the world calls me weak. In exchange, your family stays alive and your debt is cleared. You aren't just a maid anymore, Zuri. You are the keeper of the king's truth. The realization shattered her understanding of her place in Korea. She wasn't just working off a debt. She had been drafted into a war. As he tucked the passport back into his jacket, Zuri realized that nothing about survival was wrong, but the price of her life was now tied to the man the rest of the world had fatally underestimated. The silence that followed Dae-sung's departure was heavier than his physical presence had been. Zuri stood alone in the center of the vast suite, her breath hitching in the cold, conditioned air. She moved toward the nightstand, her eyes searching for any sign of a telephone or a way to reach the world outside these reinforced glass walls. She found a sleek, obsidian-colored device, but as she lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. Only a pre-recorded message in a language she didn't understand, spoken in a voice as mechanical and cold as the estate itself. She rushed to the window, pressing her forehead against the glass. Below, the streets of Seoul were a blurred river of neon lights and rushing cars, thousands of people moving through a life she was no longer permitted to join. She was in the heart of one of the busiest cities on earth, yet she had never felt more isolated. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. Her passport was gone, her money was non-existent, and her protector was a man who moved like a shadow and commanded like a king. Zuri walked to the heavy mahogany door and turned the handle. It didn't budge. The gilded cage was literal. She wasn't just a maid who had seen too much. She was a prisoner of a secret that the rest of the world mocked. She thought of the rivals who called Dae-sung a failing relic, and realized that if they ever discovered she knew the truth, they wouldn't just kill her to get to him. They would erase her. Her safety, and the safety of her family in Kampala, now rested entirely on her ability to remain invisible while knowing everything. She sank onto the edge of the silk-covered bed, her dark skin a sharp contrast to the white fabric that felt like chains. Every floorboard that creaked, every distant sound of the city, now felt like a threat. She was a prized acquisition in a game of high-stakes deception, and the rules were simple. Silence meant survival, and the truth was a death sentence. As the moon climbed higher over the skyline, Zuri finally understood that she couldn't run from the predator's grace. She could only hope to survive within it. The door to the suite didn't just open. It hissed, the heavy electronic locks disengaging with a sound that felt like a final sentence. Kang Dae-sung stood there, his black suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded with muscle and aged like fine weathered oak. He didn't ask her to follow. He simply turned, and Zuri, driven by a mixture of terror and an inexplicable pull toward the only source of power she knew, stepped into the hallway behind him. He led her not back toward the servants' quarters, but deep into the subterranean levels of the estate. They entered a room that looked less like a home and more like a war room. Walls of flickering monitors displayed live feeds not just from Seoul, but from shipping docks in Mombasa, warehouses in London, and darkened alleys in Kampala. "This is the shadow I cast, Zuri," Dae-sung said, his voice a low vibration in the cool, sterilized air. "The world sees an old man clinging to a chair, but through these screens I breathe. This empire spans 3 countries, and every inch of it is built on a foundation of secrets." He pointed to a monitor showing a group of men in a high-end Seoul boardroom. They were laughing, drinking expensive whiskey, and mocking a photo of Dae-sung on a tablet. "Those are the vultures. They think my age has turned my blood to water. They believe that by marrying a young woman and hiding in this house, I am admitting defeat." He turned to Zuri, his predatory grace more evident than ever in the blue light of the screens. "They are waiting for me to take a final breath so they can tear this apart. But what they don't know is that I have already moved the pieces. I am the one holding the leash." Zuri looked at the screen showing Kampala, her heart stopping at the sight of a familiar street corner. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a maid or a secret keeper. She was a tiny vital gear in a global machine of criminal power hidden beneath polished elegance. "If I fall," Dae-sung whispered, Stepping so close she could see the dark coiling ink of his tattoo pulsing with the movement of his throat. The men on those screens will burn everything you love just to find my ledgers. Your silence isn't just for me, Zuri. It is the only thing keeping your world from turning to ash. She looked from the monitors to the man beside her, realizing that the gilded cage was much larger than she had ever imagined. She was standing in the very heart of the storm, and the only person protecting her was the monster who had captured her. The blue glow of the monitors cast long, distorted shadows across the room, but for the first time, Zuri didn't recoil from them. She looked at the man standing beside her, the 70-year-old boss the world thought was fading, and saw him for the predator he truly was. The fear that had once paralyzed her hadn't vanished, but it had hardened into something sharper, something that felt like resolve. She understood now that in this gilded cage in Seoul, innocence was a luxury she could no longer afford. Daesung moved toward her, his predatory grace, closing the final few inches of space between them. He didn't look at her with the pity one might show a servant, but with the intense, calculated focus of a man who had finally found a worthy witness. He reached out, his hand steady as it cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a touch that was not out of affection but possession. It was a claim, a silent oath that she was now part of his shadow, as much a part of his empire as the ships in the harbor or the ledgers in his safe. You have a choice, Zuri, he whispered, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. You can remain the maid who trembles in the corner, or you can be the woman who stands at the right hand of the man they all fear. Either way, you are mine. But only one of those paths keeps your family alive. Zuri looked up at him, her wide eyes no longer just frozen in terror, but reflecting the cold light of the screens. She thought of the mockery of his rivals and the shattering secret she held in her heart. She wasn't just a prized acquisition anymore. She was the only person who knew the truth behind the mask. She leaned into his touch, a flutter in her stomach, signaling the death of the girl she used to be. I'm not a maid anymore, she said, her voice small but steady, mirroring the strength she saw in him. Daesung's lips pulled into a thin, predatory smile as he leaned down. He pressed a cold, calculated kiss to her forehead, a mark that sealed her fate more than any wedding ring ever could. The wedding dress of her innocence had been shed, and in its place was a suit of armor forged in the dark. Zuri Williams had been claimed, not for marriage and not for service, but for a survival that would change the underworld of Seoul forever. As they stood together in the Empire's shadow, Zuri realized that nothing about survival is wrong, and she was going to survive no matter the cost.